The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
On behalf of RBCS, welcome to this webinar on Why Do You Test? I'm Rex Black, President of RBCS, a worldwide testing and quality assurance firm serving clients ranging from small startups to Fortune 20 global enterprises. Since 1994, we have delivered insight and confidence to hundreds of clients around the world. Our team of international consultants deliver customized training, consulting, and outsourcing services to companies that are looking to improve their test and quality assurance practices. I'm the author of 12 books on software testing, including the bestseller Managing the Testing Process and 4 books on the ISTQB program. Attendance at today's webinar earned PMI PDUs. I would like to thank Murali Guthula, sorry Murali, botching your last name there. I would like to thank Murali Guthula for reviewing the materials for PDU status and for making valuable suggestions. Attendees will receive an email telling them how to claim PDUs, including the PDU code. PDUs are available for live webinar attendance only. Before we start the presentation, a couple notes. If you have any questions, submit them at any time through the Q&A interface. Please note that they are answered only at the end. You do not need to ask for presentation copies. The presentation is on the web. Go to rbcs-us.com and navigate to the resource tab in the upper middle, and then from there navigate to the basic library. By attending this webinar, you have been automatically registered for the free e-learning drawing. Check your email over the next couple days and watch the spam filter. Hope you enjoy these free webinars from RBCS. We do these free webinars as a service to the software testing community because at RBCS we are a not just for profit company. Okay, so today we will be talking about why do you test? What are you trying to accomplish? So a quick question to you guys in the audience. I usually only answer questions at the end, but I'm going to suggest that you open up your Q&A panel right now and ask yourself that question. Why do you test? Send me some answers. When we go through the Q&A session in the end, I'll take a look at some of those suggestions that you guys have popped up there. We'll discuss some of those. See, we have one person. Yeah, okay, we got a bunch of them coming in. Great, keep them coming, guys. Steve, Bruce, Lance, Christopher, great. Yeah, keep those coming, and what we'll do at the end is I'll go through and review those, and we can discuss some of the answers that you guys came up with. Okay, so while you're doing that. Excuse me. After you've done that and got your answers, after this webinar, what I would recommend that you do is go and talk to some colleagues that you work with who are not in the testing team and who are not testers, and ask them why they test or why they think you test, and I think you'll be interested to see that their response, what they think that you are doing, what they think that you are trying to accomplish, actually is different than what you came up with. A lot of times people have these very strange and unrealistic objectives for testing, like just make sure it works perfectly before we ship it, which of course then leads to the why didn't you find that bug comment, question. It's really more of a comment after the product is released. So the problem here is that if people have unrealistic expectations and don't match your expectations, what you're trying to accomplish, then there's going to be overall dissatisfaction, and there will be a perception that what you're doing is wrong, you're doing the wrong thing, or you're not doing it properly. I mean, your activities are not necessarily questioned because they might not know, what the activity should be, but the what you're accomplishing is questioned. So this is a problem, and what I want to do now is talk about how to solve this problem. It is, by the way, a problem I see with a lot of clients. This is not an unusual thing. So if you find that your objectives and the overall organizational objectives for testing don't match, don't think, oh my God, that's strange. How could that possibly have happened? This is actually a very typical situation, hence this webinar. So let's talk about how to set up some objectives that you can agree upon with your colleagues outside of the testing organization, and objectives that are measurable, so you can actually demonstrate that you did not break anything. Oops, sorry. Send me a comment, I just read it off. So you can demonstrate that you are actually achieving your objectives. Okay, so I have to stop looking at these comments as they're coming in. There are a lot of good ones popping in here. So the fancy name for what you're trying to do with establishing test objectives is defining a test policy. Now, a lot of times when people talk about policies, or these kind of airy, disconnected from reality sort of things, like quality policies. You can go out on some companies' websites and they have these quality policies, and you look at it and it's just like, yeah, okay, right. So I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about here is policy in the sense of, look, this is actually what we want to accomplish. This is why we're doing something. Your objectives are going to be set out in the test policy. And when you follow the process that I'm about to describe here, generate the policy, then this will be reflective of the overall goals and values of your organization, because you are going to create it in a collaborative way. You're not just going to sit down and write, this is our policy for testing. You're going to instead say, let's talk to other people, stakeholders and managers, about what our policy for testing should be, and we'll capture that in this test policy document, and then we can refer to that and use that as a communication tool. Now, sometimes people go, well, we're agile, so we don't like to document things. Well, for one thing, being agile doesn't mean not documenting things, but even if you're in an organization where people are very document averse, what we're talking about here is a short 1 to 2 page kind of statement of these are our objectives, this is what we're trying to accomplish, this is how we're going to measure whether we've accomplished it. So what do we cover in this document? Well, the document should make it clear the value that's being delivered by testing and the objectives that you're trying to serve. Okay, so anybody looking at that document, especially non-test people and especially senior managers, should be able to look at it and say, oh, I see. Okay, that's what they do. That's why it matters. Now, in terms of objectives, there are 4 fairly typical objectives of testing: building confidence, detecting defects, generating information, and managing risks to the quality of the system. Now, a lot of you have already said what your objectives are, which we'll go through. Some of them might match that. Some of them might be refinements of one or more of those. And some of them might be completely different, which is fine. It is certainly possible to have different objectives for testing. I throw these 4 out there just as examples. Now, in addition to having the defined objectives, you want to make sure that you have a way of measuring how effectively and efficiently you are carrying them out, and the extent to which you are satisfying people with the way that you are carrying them out. Now, I gave a webinar on testing metrics a while back. It's recorded and it's out on the digital library. You want to take a look at it and take a listen. Listen and a look, because it's recorded, so you get the whole presentation. It's important to be able to measure those things: effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. They sound like they would be the same, but they're in fact different, overlapping in a sense, but they are different. So effectiveness has to do with whether you're accomplishing the objectives, and to what extent you are accomplishing the objectives. Efficiency has to do with the cost involved with accomplishing the objectives. And satisfaction has to do with whether people are satisfied in the way in which you are accomplishing the objectives. And you really want to be effective, efficient, and satisfying. Any one of those three legs of the stool is missing and the stool falls over. Now, it's not enough to just have metrics for your effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. In other words, how you're going to measure it. You need to also have goals, predefined goals, so that if you attain those goals, then people will all agree, yes, it is effective. Yes, it is efficient. Yes, it is satisfying our needs. So, don't leave out the creation of the goals. Often it's the case that a test policy, at least if it's like a two-page policy, will have a sort of a diagram that shows where testing fits into the overall life cycle and what the test process looks like. That can be helpful just to give people a high-level overview of how you test. Now, the how you test really should be described in test strategy or test plan. So you don't want to get into too many the details of how you do the testing, but to give people an overview and some visibility into the test process is a good idea here. It's also a good idea to mention in your policy document how you intend to engage in continuous improvement. Now, again, not a long statement here, but something like, periodic retrospectives. Quarterly retrospectives are used to assess our effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction metrics and look for opportunities to enhance those. Something along those lines. Or if you're in an agile environment, you might say that as part of each end of sprint or end of iteration retrospective, we consider how to make testing more effective, more efficient, and more satisfying. The policy should be one that is applicable across all projects. If there are subtle differences between new development and maintenance, or between large projects and small projects, those should be spelled out, how those differences are taken into account. There are significant differences, then you might actually have to have a separate policy for development and maintenance. That would be unusual in my experience, but it is possible, and it's certainly something to be considered. If there is some kind of company glossary or terminology standard that you're using in the policy, then you want to make sure to reference it. If not, or if no such thing exists, then do your readers a favor, avoid acronyms that they're not going to be able to understand unless you actually define the acronym on its first use. Okay, so that's the content of a policy. Well, how to go about getting there. Here is a simple process, 7 steps, that will allow you to clearly define your objectives, why you test, and put that in place with the full consensus and participation of your stakeholders, including management colleagues, senior managers, and executives, and define what constitutes acceptable levels of performance of your team. So what we'll do now is we'll walk through each one of these 7 steps and see how you would go about accomplishing them. So the first step is having some interviews or workshops with your stakeholders. Now, a workshop, what I'd be talking about here is actually having a meeting where you get together your key test stakeholders and have an open-ended discussion. Interviews would be, you identify that same set of people, but instead of getting them all together all at once, you meet with them one-on-one. The workshops have to recommend them the fact that when the workshop is done, if it is concluded successfully, you will have achieved consensus on the objectives, the test objectives. But on the downside, they can be quite time consuming. So whereas the interviews could be as little as an hour, the workshop, it would be difficult to imagine that unless you already had a remarkable degree of consensus among your stakeholders as to what you were doing, that consensus already existed, then you could conceivably get the workshop done fairly quickly. But what's more likely the case is that there is not such a consensus, and that's, of course, one of the reasons why you're doing this exercise to begin with. And the workshop could take a while, hours. And so then you get into this issue of, well, am I really going to be able to schedule a meeting with some of these people who are probably fairly senior, and some of them, and fairly busy? Am I really going to be able to schedule a meeting with these people that lasts 3 to 4 hours? What happens when I send them an invite for a 3-hour meeting? Or you could say, well, I'll just send them an invite for a 1-hour meeting, and then if it goes longer, it goes longer. Well, no, that's not going to fly, because people will schedule other meetings back to back, so they'll just get up and leave, which will then undermine the whole point of having the workshop. If you schedule it for an hour on the assumption that, we already have a pretty good consensus here at this organization, so we should be able to finish it in an hour, well, you could be unpleasantly surprised, and then that meeting would break up with a certain amount of acrimony and, potentially acrimony, at the very least, an understanding that very little was accomplished other than exposing the disagreements, which there is some value in that, but it's not as valuable as actually getting to consensus. And then a final thing to consider if you want to go the workshop route is, can you actually manage the workshop? You're likely to have some fairly senior people in that meeting, as I said, people with strong opinions, people who are perhaps used to some amount of deference. You get these people who are both consider themselves fairly senior people. They have certain opinions. They're in disagreement with each other. It could be challenging for you if you are trying to intervene in an argument between two people who are senior to you, especially if one of those people happens to be your boss or someone in your chain of command, as it were, above you. There are just some challenges with managing the workshops. The workshops are great when they work, but when they fall apart, it can be a problem. So what I would encourage you to do is, if you're very confident in your ability to manage the workshop, you have the kind of folks that like to get together and have these conversations. It's not going to be like pulling teeth to get them. Then, you can do that. But if you're in any way in doubt about doing it via workshops, you do the one-on-one interviews. Now, you probably can't just sit down and say, okay, well, you tell me why I'm testing. It's a good idea in these interviews to actually have some suggestions. So the 4 typical objectives that I mentioned before, finding the defects, especially the ones that are most important, reducing risk to an acceptable level, risk of failure in production to an acceptable level, supporting an informed decision throughout the life cycle through providing information, especially release-related information, and just building confidence overall in that the testing is done properly and that the software works properly, assuming the test results support that. So you might throw those out as typical objectives of testing, or you can start with the ones that you sent me via your Q&A panel, if you think those are pretty good representations of what you do. And just use that to sort of seed the process. And then at that point, start brainstorming with the stakeholder to try to refine these and perhaps add additional ones. Okay, so you go through this sequence of interviews or the workshop. You now have a bunch of notes, or maybe you have a bunch of pictures of whiteboards, depending on how you tend to have meetings and such in your organization. And so now you have to collect the objectives that you were given, put them together in some sort of list. Now, it's possible that that some of the objectives that were brought up are not really reasonable. They're not realistic. What you will want to do at that point is set those off into another list. Make sure you know who it was that brought that objective up with you, and at some point as you continue to move through this process, before surprising people with the list of the proposed draft objectives, talk to the people that gave you the objectives that you think are not realistic, and explain why that's not an objective that can really be accomplished. You can also do that during the interview that we just discussed, but the risk there is that you will get caught up in an argument, which might not be, well, it might be counterproductive. If it's a brainstorming session, the basic rule of there are no bad ideas applies. So if you've framed that as a brainstorming session, you're capturing the ideas, and you suddenly start arguing with the person about a suggestion that they have, that's going to derail the brainstorming session, and you're going to come across as kind of, I don't know, unreliable is the wrong word, but if you invite someone to a brainstorming session and then midway through the brainstorming session you start criticizing the ideas they're throwing out, either you're not clear on the concept of what brainstorming is, or you're not being consistent about what the meeting's about, which is, those are not complimentary, but they're better than the other two options that the person might think. Well, they might think that you're a dilettante and that you're in over your head with what you're trying to do with accomplishing these objectives, or if there's some existing tension between you and the interviewee, they might see that as an ambush, that you got them into a meeting to talk about what the objectives of testing are, only to argue with them, and so they might be pretty unhappy about that. I would suggest that what you do is, after you have come up with your draft list of achievable, realistic objectives, go back with the unrealistic and unachievable objectives to the authors and say, look, I just wanted to let you know that we had to leave one of your suggestions off the list, and here's why, and be able to make a good, strong case for that. Yes, that will not be a fun conversation. There will be some tension there, but it's going to be better than what's going to happen if you just drop that person's suggestion and then proceed to roll out your draft list of objectives, because what will happen in that case is that the person will notice that their idea has been cut out, and they will probably come back to you directly or come to the next review meeting, if there is a review meeting or a review email thread, and grouse very loudly about how they had ideas, specific ideas that they suggested, and they've been cut out, and what's up with this process anyway. So you're going to have to deal with it deal with the harsh reality of what happens when you drop somebody's pet objective, and the only question is, how do you want to deal with it? I'm suggesting that dealing with it before it becomes a political issue out in the open is going to be better. Now, coming back to, we've got this list of realistic, achievable objectives. What's the next step? Well, the next step would be metrics, how we're going to measure. So we need to kind of get there. Now, we're not quite at the point of being able to define the metrics, though, because what we want to make sure is we've got these nailed down first. So what we're going to do is take an intermediate step and ask 3 questions. What would it mean to be effective for this objective? What would it mean to be efficient? What would it mean to do this in a way that was satisfying? You can see an example here. If we look at defect detection, we take that objective. We say, as a defect finding organization, XYZ, you, test team, finds most of the defects present during test execution and almost all of the important defects. So you're able to say, okay, here's our objective, and this is what it would mean to be effective at it, efficient at it, satisfying at it. Okay, so notice it's kind of a halfway step to metrics. We know what we're going to measure, right? What basically what proportion of the defects do we find? But we haven't yet defined how we're going to measure it, which is fine, because first what we need to do is get a consensus on these objectives and what the effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction statements say. So with that in mind, we go to the next step. So again, I'm assuming here in this step that you have managed any potential conflicts associated with objectives that were suggested that had to be left out because they were unrealistic or unachievable. So I'm going to assume that that's been handled. So you now send out this document, the objectives and the supporting statements, to the different stakeholders who are involved in the different interviews and or workshops. And then you schedule a review meeting. Now this meeting should be something that you can have in an hour. Ideally, this meeting would have all of the stakeholders present at once, because if you have multiple meetings and conflicting changes are suggested in those meetings, now you're stuck in the middle of a debate between two of your stakeholders that you might or might not be enthusiastic about moderating. Whereas if they're in the room together, then they can have that back and forth discussion directly. You should probably expect to get some feedback and some suggestions, and you should expect that there will be some changes, and if the changes are minor, then you can send the final version out, say here's what we agreed with the agreed changes. If the changes are more significant, then you would have to have a re-review. Now, if after the second re-review you're still discovering major issues, then probably makes sense to step back a little bit and ask yourself why. And are we on a path to actually getting this done? In some circumstances, which thankfully are rare, people can be what I refer to as an anti-stakeholder in a process. So a stakeholder in a process is somebody who has some degree of engagement in that process, not necessarily as a participant, but at least they have an interest in the outcome if they're not actually a participant, and they want that process to succeed. An anti-stakeholder is somebody who has a strong interest in a process and they want that process to fail. So it is possible that you could be dealing with an anti-stakeholder situation. If there is somebody who does not want you to have a clear view of what you're trying to accomplish and how to measure success, then that person, if they're involved in this effort, the way to achieve that is by continually bringing up new, heretofore unraised objections or suggestions, ideally ones that are confounding, that will really send you and other people off into a tizzy trying to figure out how to resolve it. I've known some managers who were real artists at this. I mean, to the point of view that if there were awards being given for obfuscation and road blocking, that those guys would be in the pantheon. So be careful if you're in that kind of situation, because if you continue to have to iterate on this, it's going to eventually wear people out. They're going to give up on it. They're going to think that was a stupid, time-wasting exercise. And guess what? Your anti-stakeholder will potentially have prevailed in what they are trying to do. So if you feel like that's happening, then escalating to your manager is probably a smart thing to do. Now, that said, don't just go, okay, well, we did a review, we noticed some problems, we fixed the problems, I sent those out, and now we're done. You have to watch out for the stakeholder who is actually an anti-stakeholder and whose best interests are served by being an obstructionist. That's absolutely true. But at the same time, you have to be careful that you're not assuming that somebody's is acting in an obstructionist way and just bulldozering them, ignoring their input. Because what can happen there is you might think you got away with it in the sense that you just kind of poo-pooed them and said, well, look, we're not doing that, or thank you very much for your input, within sotto voce, which I will happily ignore, right? You want to avoid someone feeling like, hey, I made the trouble of participating in this exercise that I didn't really understand very well to begin with. I tried to participate, and I got blown off. I got given lip service, because that can create either immediate or long-term problems with that individual if they feel like they were mishandled. So remember, any engagement with your stakeholders has to be treated very carefully. Okay, so now hopefully we have consensus on the objectives and the statements that I mentioned before, answering the questions of effectiveness, efficiency, and satisfaction. So now we are actually able to create metrics. So what you do is you go, okay, so for this particular effectiveness statement, how would I measure? And usually if you phrase the statement properly, it should be pretty straightforward. So for example, with the defect finding statement that I gave before, the obvious metric there is, well, what percentage of the defects do I find prior to release? That's referred to as defect detection effectiveness, logically enough, because it's an effectiveness metric for defect detection. And it can be calculated as shown here. So remember that the statement said not only that we find most defects, but we find almost all of the important defects. So we actually have to calculate this twice and make sure that the defect detection effectiveness for the important defects is higher than the overall defect detection effectiveness. So hopefully this is not an onerous thing to do, this calculation. Now, unfortunately, sometimes there can be some challenges here. One of the challenges is that people say, well, I can't disaggregate the production defect information by project. It's all lumped together, and we don't know how it relates to a single project necessarily. So there's really no way of calculating the defect detection effectiveness on a project-by-project basis. Okay, if that's the case, no big deal. I mean, it's ideal would be to look at that, but it's okay to just do it with all of the numbers. Now, when I say all the numbers, usually you want to say over the past calendar year, or if your projects tend to be, say, longer than 6 months, probably the last 2 calendar years. And of course, you also have to look at, how do we define important on both the test side and the production side? Can we come up with a way of aggregating that information? It's a little bit of a challenge. Any one of these metrics you come up with, you might very well be challenged. Don't give up on it immediately, but if it turns out, hey, it is actually impossible to measure something for one of these objectives, see if you can come up with a surrogate metric. A surrogate metric is one that that you can measure, that while not directly measuring the thing that you've set out to measure, it indirectly measures it. So, for example, requirements coverage can be a surrogate metric for confidence building. The higher the percentage of requirements that you've covered, the more confident you can be in the system, assuming that the test results say that it looks good. Now, this is not, this is not a teeny problem here or a teeny task. Keep in mind, if you've got 4 or 5 objectives, then you're basically looking at 15 statements, right? For 3 for each of the objectives, 1 for effectiveness, 1 for efficiency, 1 for satisfaction. So do carve out some time to spend some serious thought on this, and don't be frustrated if at first go you can't immediately think of a metric, especially if this is not something you're used to doing. As a consultant, I do this kind of thing all the time, so it comes pretty naturally to me. But you might find it more of a challenge. Keep at it. Eventually, you got your metrics defined. Now, at this point, you want to baseline where you are now. Okay. So take your measurements. This is basically going to test drive your suggested metrics too, because if you can't take the measurements to calculate the metric, and you might say, oh, well, wait a minute, we thought we could do this, but we actually can't. So we better rethink this one. If you have to rethink it, then of course, then come back to this step and baseline that one. Now, you might find that the underlying measurements are theoretically available, but that your current process doesn't do a very good job of supporting those measurements. So you might have to change some of your tools and the way they're set up to take those measurements in an accurate, timely fashion. So be ready for that discovery. A lot of times I go into organizations that don't have any metrics program in place and find indeed that that is a big part of the problem, that they don't have their tools set up in a way that will allow them to gather the information. So in that case, it may take you a while to get to the point where you've got sufficient data after you fix these tools. It's not like you fix the tool and Shazam, all of a sudden you've got all the data you need. That might not be the case. Now, let's assume that you've got your metrics and they're truly measurable metrics, and you baseline and you've got your numbers. Now what do you do? And well, the obvious question is, is it good? Are we okay? Are we doing a good job? So part of this is about reasonable expectations. What would you expect the answer to be? Like with requirements coverage, yes, you would expect 100% requirements coverage. If it were less than that, people would say, well, wait, why are we not testing everything? Now, that could happen because of external reasons, not just internal reasons. But, if the numbers look funky, look weird compared to what you would expect, then, it'd be a good idea to say, we've identified a problem. Now we need to think about how to fix that problem. Now, it might be that you say, well, I don't really know what a reasonable expectation would be, in which case you want to do some benchmarking and see if you can find some industry averages or some numbers from colleagues or something. Where are they? So that'd be another way of trying to set some initial goals where you need to be. What we want to do at the end of this step is to actually have metrics with goals defined. It's quite possible that you are going to find that in one or more ways you do not meet the mark at this point. That's okay. You just need to now start evolving towards meeting the mark. You have all of the raw materials available to create your test policy. You've got your objectives, you've got your metrics for each objective, got targets established for the objectives, so we can say, yes, we are satisfying our stakeholders, yes, we are effective, yes, we are efficient. You're able to tie those objectives to a mission statement, if you will. Now, this is another one of those phrases that really gets people's hackles up, because they've seen a lot of vague or silly, vacuous kinds of mission statements. But what I'm talking about here is a summary of your objectives in a way that really captures this is the value that is delivered by testing to our organization. And again, as I said, basic test process. Can you come up with a simple Visio diagram that shows where you fit into the life cycle? And can you make some statements on how you intend to improve? Again, try to keep this short, 1 to 2 pages. I've seen these bloat out to be 3, 4, 10 pages long. The longer they are, the less likely it is that people will read them and internalize them. So that texting acronym TLDR, too long, didn't read, keep that in mind here. You're going to be putting this in front of some people that have a very limited amount of time to spend thinking about testing, potentially even chief executives, presidents of the company. You want to make sure that you have made this concise. Of course, not cryptic. Everything that's in there needs to be clear, but it needs to be very much at a high level. Okay, so now you're on the downhill slope here. You've done all the hard work, right? Well, almost. There's still one last bit of politicking, if you will, that has to be done here, and to be fair, course correction might be necessary. So review with your fellow testers, with your test team. If you're in an agile organization that doesn't have a test manager per se, but you do some sort of testing scrum of scrums or something like that, where the testers get together, work with the other testers to have this review and make some adjustments. Hopefully at this point they're very small adjustments. If they're big adjustments, that could be a problem. That could indicate that you didn't get enough upfront involvement of the testers. Now, once you've dealt with tester feedback and you want to go and again go through a final review with the stakeholders, make changes if you need to, but hopefully you don't, because the stakeholders will have seen most of this. Where they're most likely to get concerned would be if they think that your goals for one or more of your objectives are unreasonably low, that you're not holding yourself to a high enough standard. So if you think that that's a possible outcome, be ready to have some justification for, hey, where did these metrics come from anyway? And where did these goals come from? Why are they reasonable? Make sure that you're ready to address that. Once that is in place, then it's time to get the senior executives and senior managers informed. Again, they're likely to have limited attention span for this kind of thing, but you certainly want to get it to them and have them look at it. Some of them will, and will give you comments. Again, if it's 1 to 2 pages, it won't take very long for them to look at it and give you comments. If they do have comments, you might need to make some adjustments again. Yes, I know, sounds tedious. It's like review and adjust, review and adjust, review and adjust. Yes, there are 3 review and adjust cycles here. But remember, what we're trying to do is get everybody on the same page, as the cliche goes, in terms of what we're doing, what we're trying to accomplish. So yes, there's going to be a politicking layer of that, a selling the policy. Once these review and revise cycles are over, you can finalize the document and release it. Say this is our official test policy. Hopefully, everybody whose opinion about testing matters has already been involved, So it's not your document, it's our document. Okay, so why did I just spend 45 minutes of your time and mine talking about this? Well, because this is a common problem. When I first started doing consulting work in testing, I expected to find that most problems that test teams had were due to technical issues, competence issues, lack of resource issues, and certainly all of those issues exist. I'm not saying that I don't see those. I do see them. But the most significant issues that I see, the ones that's caused the most problems for test teams, is a mismatch in terms of expectations. Do people really understand what testing can accomplish? Answer is generally no. Sometimes even people in testing. So this process that I've shown you here, fairly simple. Yes, it's hard work, but it's very straightforward. Can solve that problem where it exists. And you should assume that problem exists rather than assume that it doesn't. If you're sitting here listening to me going, yeah, I get that can be a problem for other organizations, but we're a really tight organization and we work really well together, so surely we don't have this problem. You still might. Maybe people are polite and they don't want to tell you that they have no clue as to what you're doing, or they think you're not doing the right things, or they think you're doing the right things but you're not anywhere near effective or efficient enough about them. They might just be too polite to say that. So working through this process will expose those problems and will allow you to resolve them. And once those have been resolved, that can then be captured in this test policy document, which is now a ready reference for others who are confused in the future. Of course, it might need to be kept up to date, but really shouldn't need to be kept up to date all that much because, again, it's an expression of why you test, not an expression of how you test. How you test, your test strategy will, of course, continue to evolve. The test policy should be, this is why we test. It's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's how we measure how we're doing, how effective, efficient, satisfying our process is, and these are our goals that allow us to say we're good. Okay, so with that said, let's put the ad up here, and I will go back and let's look at some of these suggestions that people had here. So let's see, Stephen, objective of testing, to provide information to stakeholders about the quality of the product. Yep, great, that'd be one that I would have. Risk reduction for the customer, says Bruce. Yep. Lance says to find defects before they get to the customer. Yep, absolutely. Now, of course, we want to measure that in terms of some percentage, not all of them, but most of them. Jim says, it is my job. Well, there's that. They pay you to do it, but what exactly are they paying you to do, Jim? Ethan says, to verify functionality has been met. All right, so that's basically confidence building against the requirements. Oh, yeah. Related to that, Christopher's comment, to ensure that requirements are met. Yep, verification again. Deb says, to give the end user a better product. Now, interesting one, that. We test to support a broader organizational goal, right? A broader organizational objective. So that Deb's statement is, of course, true. And this can be captured in terms of the mission statement that you have. We support the organizational goal of delivering high quality products to our end users by finding defects, reducing risk, building confidence, and providing information to stakeholders throughout the software process, something along those lines, tying them together. But yes, very important point there, Deb, that what we do and why we do it is in support of a larger goal for the organization. So we've been talking about objectives and goals for the test team. There are also objectives and goals for the entire organization, which we support, and our objectives and our goals have to be aligned with those. David says, verify fitness for use. Yep, so again, confidence building. Kathy says, to make sure our customers do not have business interruptions. Okay. So reliability of service there. So that's reducing the risk of these kinds of interruptions. Jay says, to review the software as created and to make sure that it matches expectations, both documented requirements and expected behavior as a regular user. Excellent. So Jay, you're bringing up you don't just verify against requirements, you also validate that the system does what it needs to do. And that was the fitness for use that was brought up before, Geran's definition of quality, which includes both documented and undocumented requirements. Sarah says, to ensure that we send out a high quality product to our customer. Yep. Again, I think this is the larger organizational goal or larger organizational objective that is supported by testing, and the test-specific objectives can be tied to that. Now, you might wonder why I'm sort of splitting that here, going, well, how is it that this is a higher organizational goal? Well, ask yourself how you would check this, right? I mean, one of the ways that you would be looking at this is through this particular objective that Sarah's mentioned, to ensure that we send out a high-quality product to our client. The way that you would end up measuring that would be by looking at things like customer satisfaction surveys and frequency of failure in production and those kinds of things. But notice that those are not metrics that are entirely under your control. So the reason for saying that there's higher organizational reason for doing testing, and that's fine, but we're going to focus on the specific things that testing is trying to accomplish, is to make sure that when we go to take these measurements, that we're measuring things that can actually be controlled by the testing process. Mike, to protect the company brand, yep, that's a good way of putting it. I would consider that to be risk mitigation, risk reduction. Catch deviation from the requirements, says Kay. Yep, find bugs. Mitigate risk, from Christopher. Val says, we want to verify the requirements are met and the user expectations will be met and hopefully exceeded. Yep. So again, confidence building. How good is our product? Verify the requirements have been satisfied, says Elizabeth. Yep. There we go. More confidence. Measure quality. Yeah. That's from Scott. It's information. Michael says, again, we test as a measure of the quality of the product. Yep. G says, make sure software meets both specified and unspecified requirements. Yep. Heard that one. Martin says, to verify that all requirements have been met and that unexpected results do not occur. Yes. So confidence building again. How do you guys get talking about this in terms of confidence? Protect our customers from error/issues and ensure compliance. Yeah, risk reduction. Matt says, to verify conformance to requirements. Okay, that's a good part of it. That's part of confidence building. Of course, the requirements by themselves being imperfect, you have to measure against more than just that. Jill says, review and verify expected results and validate what was expected is actually delivered. Yep. More reduction of risk and building confidence. Erkki from Finland says, to shed light for unknown system properties. So that's kind of the voyage into the unknown part of it, right? Reducing risk by understanding where what kind of weirdness might exist. All right, so Craig has a list here, which he starts with verify product meets requirements. Yep. And he mentions verify that the product meets the customer's needs. That's his verification and validation there. Samantha says, validate the system is working as expected. Yep, so information, confidence building to ensure a solid product for our end users. Now, again, here I would say, Stephanie, that this is a corporate goal, which you can support, but you know, it's you by yourself cannot ensure the solid product for the end users, right? What you're doing is in support of that solid product. Kathy, longtime listener, says, I test because I love to do it. There is just something within me that I can't explain. It's like working on puzzles all day. So this is I think interesting in that there's the objectives that you're trying to serve as a test team, and then there's why people who are testers like to be testers and enjoy their job. Now, if you are a test manager, it is wise to understand among your testers why they like to test, what they find satisfying, fulfilling about that job, and make sure that you can relate the day-to-day activities and the overall objectives of the organization to what they're what makes them tick. Ken says, why test? Because we tend not to work with CMMI level 5 development organizations. Well, I think even if you had CMMI level 5 development organizations, you'd still need to test. But you know, you might find that in that circumstance that you do a lot less bug finding and a lot more confidence building. All right, Ethan says discover bugs. Yep, detect defects. Jonathan says validate intended design meets actual output. For example, does the software feature thing meet the specification? And many more reasons, I'm sure. Yep, so there's the confidence building again. A lot of you talking about confidence building. Paul says testing ensures the applications function per the requirements and serves the users appropriately. Mentions defect-free. Well, of course, we can't really prove that the software is defect-free, but we can build confidence that those defects that aren't there are not all that serious, right? Harvey says, we test because developers don't know how to break what they have coded. Yeah, so that's getting to the need for an independent test, an independent organization to come in and say, you know, we can be more effective at finding defects than the developers, which is definitely true. Jennifer says, why test? To establish the current state of code to determine if it is production ready. Yeah, there you go. So again, confidence. A lot of you mentioning some variation of confidence. To find problems that might impact the value of the product and inform stakeholders of my findings. That's from Amanda, so that's the information producing aspect. Ethan says, make sure the changes that were made didn't affect other functionality. So they're interesting. So now you're pointing to a very specific kind of risk that you're trying to mitigate, a regression risk, which is good. It's good. And if you're doing testing of software that's in maintenance, that's important to point that out. Mary says, we test to make sure the software meets client needs, so there's confidence building, and to be worthy of the award bonus upon release acceptance. Well, yep. Every now and then we got to work for the biscuit, right? Stefan says, we test software. Stefan or Stephen. We test software in order to reveal as many bugs as is economically reasonable prior to the product's release. System critical defects should be the highest priority. Yep, so there's the defect detection. Okay, so those were the suggestions that folks had. Notice that there's a lot of variations and refinements of the four sort of default or typical objectives that I mentioned. And a number of you did mention higher level organizational objectives that are supported by testing. And of course, your objectives need to be traceable to those higher level objectives. Gregorio asks, what could be an intangible value of testing? So let me distinguish tangible and intangible. So defect detection provides a tangible value. I can measure that because I can look at the relative cost of detecting a defect in production versus testing. Every time I find a defect in testing, I save the organization, or at least I offer the organization the opportunity to save the difference between the cost of the defect in production and the cost of the defect in testing, which is often significant, multiple thousands of dollars at least, often even bigger gaps than that. So that's a clearly measurable value of testing. Now, how about confidence building? What number do we put on the confidence that someone has in the software when they release it? Hard to put a number on it, hard to measure it, but certainly that is one of the key things that people want. I've had multiple project managers tell me, hey, my main concern is that when we release, I don't spend the next 2 or 3 weeks in a cold sweat, worrying about what horrible thing is going to happen in production. So, for them, confidence building is a big deal. So I point that out because you may very well find that there are some of these objectives that you define that are hard to measure. And these kind of intangible values are often measurable through some kind of survey approach. You can use what's called a Likert scale, Likert. There's a reasonably good Wikipedia article on Likert scales. If you've not heard of that, you can use that to measure some of these more intangible things, as well as using surveys to measure the degree of stakeholder satisfaction. Val now asks a very important question. How do you calculate defect detection effectiveness, or DDE, in Agile projects when defects may not be documented in a sprint? For example, tester talks to developer and the defect is corrected as a result of that conversation. This gets to exactly one of the problems I have with some implementations of Agile, where defects are not captured in any way during sprints. Basically, anytime you choose not to document defects found by a testing activity, and this is true of unit testing, it's true of integration testing, system testing, any testing activity, reviews, anytime you choose not to capture any information about the number and type and severity of defects found in that process, you lose visibility into the defect detection effectiveness of that process, period. There's just no two ways around this. You don't have a way of getting reliable metrics out of that process if you don't capture some information about them. Now, I understand that you've had people like the Poppendings running around going, us don't track defects, and I'm sure for various reasons, especially organizations where developers have been burned by defect metrics before, you get a lot of people willing to jump on that boat and go, oh yeah, sure, it's inefficient to track defects. Well, yes, there can be a cost, and that cost can be exacerbated if the heavyweight tracking process is put in place. But there's a cost to having a speedometer in a car. There is. It's a piece of equipment, and it has a cost, and it does impose, speedometer imposes a drag on the operation of the motor. It's not a huge one, but it is running the speedometer is sucking energy out of the out of the car to some extent. But you need to know how fast you're going. Same thing here. Yes, you are going to have some costs associated with measuring defects. Yep, you will. Can you minimize that? Yes, you can. But can you simply say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't want to incur any cost. I don't want any overhead whatsoever in my software engineering process associated with tracking defects. Okay, that's fine. Organizations can make that decision as long as they accept that they will have zero visibility into the defect detection effectiveness of the testing processes that are within that no measurements regime. So it's just that straightforward. Let's see. Courtney says, the terms get misused. How do you explain the difference between test policy, test plan, and test strategy? Okay, simple. For me, anyway. I have a simple definition of it. The test policy is a document that sets out the objectives of testing. It's why you test. The test strategy is a document that talks about how you test from one project to another in a project-independent way. It's what is common about your test process at a fairly detailed level from one project to the next. The test plan is the specifics of implementing the test strategy for a particular project. And if you've got a nice solidly documented test strategy, guess what? Your test plan does not have to be too long, especially helpful in agile worlds. We have a well-defined test strategy, and your test plan is fairly brief, providing details about who's going to do what part of the test strategy when in each iteration. Diego says, could you please provide more details in terms of which aspects of the testing process should be documented in the test policy, considering that it's advisable to wrap it up in 1 or 2 pages? I like a simple Visio diagram. Simple Visio diagram that shows how testing fits into the test process, or excuse me, the development process. That really should be enough, and that should fit in 1 page, like a half-page diagram kind of thing. Some explanatory text about the diagram and the test process improvement and how that fits in. Again, keep it short. Kelly says, we didn't have the problem of knowing what we were doing until we came under the leadership of our parent company, who does not have a dedicated testing team. This document will be invaluable for us. Thank you. You're quite welcome, Kathy, and best of luck. Take it step by step. Keep it simple. Manage the politics, as I mentioned, and I think this will be very helpful for you. Matt says, while our team and internal stakeholders are tight and cohesive, this test policy can have value because we are now dealing with an external third party that does not have much testing emphasis or value. Yeah, right. It's just a nice compact way, again, 1-2 pages of communicating to people, look, this is why we're testing. This is what we're trying to accomplish. This is how we know that we've accomplished it. It's a nice, tight communication package. Mike says, I used to create this sort of document all the time about a decade ago. Used to call them test strategies, but I've found that their value has diminished a bit, diminished quite a bit. I found that it took an enormous amount of effort and time to create, but then was never looked at again. How can I justify this document to stakeholders or even to the tester creating it when they refuse to reference or use it afterwards? Okay, so Mike, important point, relevance. Yeah, I am certainly not suggesting the creation of an irrelevant document. I have seen exactly what you're talking about on multiple occasions. I see this very frequently with clients. They write test plans that talk about how things would be in an ideal world, but they're not living in the ideal world, so the test plan is not relevant. So what I'm let's go back to what I was saying you can accomplish with this policy. What you're going to accomplish by putting this document in place is achieving consensus across all the stakeholders about what you're trying to accomplish, how you're going to measure that accomplishment, and how you're going to recognize that what you're trying to accomplish has been achieved. And the point of doing that is because most of the time stakeholders don't get it. Now, keeping it short, 1 to 2 pages, forces you to make it relevant. And it shouldn't be the kind of thing that it's this big long document that's produced and people look at it and they go, whatever, it's too long, not going to read it. So yes, focus on relevance. If what I've described here today is something that you think might not be 100% relevant to your organization, well, think about how you might tweak it to make it relevant. Vitaly asks, in what units of measure all components of DDE should be measured? Okay, so units. This is a percentage, Vitaly. Let's go back to the calculation. It's a percentage. Okay, so here we have test defects. Let's get the highlighter up. Okay. Test defects, production defects. So the units on the top is defects, the units on the bottom is defects, so it cancels out, so it's a unitless metric, right? It's a percentage, effectively. It's a proportion. Okay, so hopefully that answers the question. It's not a metric that has units. So, for example, if you're measuring using cost of quality, you can measure the return on investment for testing in terms of the difference between the cost of a production defect and cost of a test defect. And the units there is dollars per defect for those two metrics, and when you do the calculation, the resulting units are in dollars. But yeah, that's a good question. I mean, you do want to think when you're creating metrics, what are the units? Okay, let's see. Pilar says, we analyze to ensure we understand client expectations, and we test to ensure our product meets those expectations. So that's back to the definition of testing. And I like the way that you sort of made these complementary in the sense that there has to be an upstream part of the process, in this case business analysis or requirements analysis, an upstream part of the process that enables the downstream part of the process that involves testing. You're absolutely right, because just testing at the end, as I'm sure all of you know, is not adequate by itself. Tom says, great topic, as always, something to consider. Thanks. You're quite welcome, Tom. Good to see you back. Jim says, how do you measure DDE when you update your versions on a daily basis? There is no clearly defined version delivered. Well, if you're in an agile world and you're getting daily versions, daily test releases, again, the important thing here is to make sure that you are capturing information about the defects that you find. At the very least, you want to have, okay, we found this defect on such and such a date. It was resolved on such and such a date. It had this severity. It was ultimately determined that it was located in this particular module. It had this particular root cause. Shazam, all right? They captured at least that kind of data. Even if the tactical stuff, like what are the steps to reproduce, so forth, that might all be handled via conversation. Now, let's say, okay, yes, you got releases going out, and a lot of releases going out in a year, and it's really difficult to correlate the production defects against the test defects in terms of which version. In that case, I would say just don't worry about it. Calculate like a rolling 12-month average, defect detection effectiveness, and that should be fine. That works for a lot of our clients. All right, so Lena says, primary objective of our lab's software testing is to identify and expose all issues and associated risks, communicate all known issues to the project team, and ensure that all issues are addressed in an appropriate manner before release. As an objective, this requires careful and methodical testing of the applications to first ensure all areas of the software are scrutinized and consequently all issues or bugs found are dealt with appropriately. A secondary objective is to assure that the delivered software meets the full requirements of the end customer, maintaining our standard of quality for the product and remaining within the cost range and delivery schedule established at the project outset. Yeah, so see, I would say that secondary objective, Lena, really is a larger organizational objective. You can support that for sure, but that's achieved through the entire software engineering process more than anything else. As far as your defined primary objective, I guess the only comment I would have on that is I would be real careful about the all statement. Identify and expose all issues, because it sounds like you're using issues as a synonym for bug. If so, then you're saying you're going to find 100% of the bugs. I don't know. Can you do that? Usually not in testing. Ensure that all issues are addressed in an appropriate manner before release. Well, you can't. Can you guarantee that they're going to get fixed? Is that the testing responsibility of testing? I can make sure that people understand the status of them. I can't necessarily ensure that they're all fixed. So some of these, I think, extend off into the larger frame of the software engineering process, which is fine. I mean, you need to have that larger thought of how the software engineering process works to ensure we deliver quality products. As testers, we support that. Lena says that is in our official test policy. Okay. So I guess my suggestion, Lena, would be maybe go back and talk to some of the folks that put that together and see if maybe some sharpening of that, some refinement of that might be in order. I think you might be overcommitting a little bit. Janet Fong asks, do you have a good example or sample of a well-written test policy that you can share? There might be one on the RBCS website, and one of the basic or advanced libraries under the test planning, possibly. I know there's an example in Advanced Software Testing Volume 2, that book has an example of a test policy in it. And as I said, there might be one out on the RBCS website. Vitaly says, I asked about the units of measures for the formula components such as test defects and production defects. Yes. Should be just quantity of the occasions? Thank you in advance. So, well, I think when you say quantity of the occasions, I think you're talking about failures, number of failures. The defect, the word defect here does not refer to the actual failure. So the defect is the underlying thing that is wrong in the software. It is the bug. It is the thing which is incorrect in the software itself. Software adds when it should subtract, or it stores a record to the wrong table or something like that. Now, those kinds of defects can cause multiple failures. Ads, when it's supposed to subtract, could cause dozens of customers or end users to file a report with the tech support folks. There could be, dozens or 100 or so failures that are noted, but it all goes back to the same defect. So it's not the number of failures; it's the number of underlying defects. Okay, great questions as always from the afternoon audience. We appreciate that. So to close this session, a little bit more about the resources available through RBCS. Most of you are probably aware that we run these free webinars once a month, so you can check our website, rbcs-us.com, to sign up. If you want a special webinar presentation for your company only of this webinar or on any other topic related to software testing, please contact us at info@rbcs-us.com or via our website. You can also sign up for our free newsletter, regular free newsletter on our website. You'll get valuable discounts on consulting and training services, and in every other month newsletter, it includes a featured free article on software testing and quality and news about what we've been up to lately. You can follow us on Twitter. We're at RBCS. Let me just put the advertisement page up here. Whoops. You can see the Twitter handles there. We're on Facebook as well, as you can see there. Remember to check your email over the next couple days, because you could have been the free lucky, winner of the lucky winner of the free e-learning course. We basically are going to take the registration or the attendee numbers, attendee names that are sent to us by GoToWebinar at the end of this event, and we use a random number generator in Excel to pick out the winner. So you may very well be the winner, and if so, look for an email from us over the next few days. Remember the RBCS website, all sorts of free resources there, basically anything but the store. If you go to the store, that's stuff we're selling. Everything else is free, including the digital library, which has recordings of these webinars, some podcasts, a bunch of videos. You can subscribe to this podcast. You can go to iTunes and enter RBCS podcast, or you can use the RSS feed on a digital library. The videos and recorded webinars are available on the digital library, but also on the RBCS channel on YouTube. Again, no charge for any of these resources. These are offered as a service to the software testing community, because at RBCS we are a not just for profit company. Concludes the webinar. Thanks to all of you for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you at future webinars.